Welcome back, fourth grade, to White Fang Chapter 13, Weed and Scott. It's hopeless, said Weed and Scott. It's a wolf and there's no taming it. He's been tamed already, Matt said. Do you see them harness marks across the chest? He was a sled dog at one time, and he was probably a good sled dog. But we've had him 2 weeks, Scott said, and if anything, he's wilder than ever. Turn him loose for a spell, Matt said. Could be the cage making him crazy. Won't he run away? Scott asked. Matt shrugged his shoulders. Only way to find out is find out. Matt grabbed a club and went over to the chained animal. The dog musher unsnapped the chain and stepped back. White Fang couldn't believe he was free. He saw the younger man toss him a piece of meat. He sprang away and studied it from a safe distance. Major, no, Matt shouted, but too late. Major, the lead sled dog, had made a spring for the meat. At the instant his jaws closed on it, White Fang's closed on Major's throat. Matt's foot kicked at White Fang. White Fang tore a gash out of Matt's leg, then jumped back. He got me all right, Matt said, holding his leg. I told you it was hopeless, Matt. There's only one thing to do, Scott said. He drew his revolver. We can't have him attacking people. But I had no right to kick him, Mr. Scott, Matt argued. Give the poor devil a chance. Please don't shoot him. I know he can be petted. Look at him. He knows he done wrong. Scott put away the revolver. White Fang lowered himself down into the snow. You're sure? Scott asked. Yes, I'm sure. He was petted at some time in his life, wasn't he? He was a sled dog. Scott believed the dog musher and slowly reached out his hand. Here, good boy. But the dog musher was mistaken. As Weed and Scott approached, White Fang snarled. Scott sat down several feet away. He remained quiet and made no movement. White Fang's snarl slowly became a low growl that grew softer and softer. Then Scott spoke. At the first sound of the man's voice, the hair rose on White Fang's neck. The growl rushed back up in his throat. But Scott made no movement and went on talking calmly. After a long time, Scott held out a small piece of meat. White Fang picked up his ears and looked at it suspiciously. Scott tossed the meat on the snow at White Fang's feet. He smelled the meat carefully, but kept his eyes on Scott. Then he slowly ate the meat. Scott offered him another piece of meat. White Fang would not take it from the hand. Again, Scott tossed it to him. Scott did this a few times, but one time, Scott held on to the meat. Bit by bit, White Fang approached the hand. A low growl rumbled in his throat. He ate the meat, and nothing happened. Piece by piece, he ate all the meat, and nothing happened. Scott went on talking, and then Scott reached forth his hand. White Fang snarled and bristled and flattened his ears, but he didn't snap or spring away. The hand touched the ends of his bristling hair. White Fang shrank down under it. He could not forget all the evil that had been done against him at the hands of men. The hand lifted and came down again in a kind, patting movement. Scott talked softly, and his hands patted gently. Well, I'll be gosh swoggled, exclaimed Matt, coming out of the cabin. White Fang leaped back, snarling savagely at Matt. Weed and Scott stood and walked over to White Fang. He talked quietly to him, then slowly put out his hand and rested it on White Fang's head. You may be a number one, tip-top mining expert, all right, Matt said, but you're a wild animal tamer, too. When you was a boy, you should have run off to join a circus. It was the beginning of the end for White Fang. It was the ending of the old life ruled by hate. It was the beginning of a new life with Weed and Scott. It was Weed and Scott's patience and love that changed White Fang. Weed and Scott was determined to tame White Fang. Each day he made it a point to pet him. White Fang grew to like this petting, but he never outgrew his growling. However, it was now a growl of contentment, and Scott knew this. White Fang had never known such kindness, and his like for Weed and Scott grew to love. He felt protective of this man who treated him fairly and gently. He prowled about the cabin while the sled dogs slept. He listened for any stranger. The first night visitor to the cabin fought him off with the club until Scott came to the rescue. Eventually, White Fang learned to tell the difference between friend and enemy. He let any man alone who stepped loudly to the cabin door, but he attacked any man who went softly and secretly. White Fang was changing. He no longer roamed the woods or hid at the corner of the cabin. Instead, he would wait for hours on the cabin steps from a sight of Weed and Scott's hand. In the late spring, Scott suddenly disappeared. White Fang had never seen a suitcase before, so he did not know what it meant. That night, he waited in the cold on the front step for his master to return, but Scott never came. In the morning, Matt opened the door and stepped outside. White Fang gazed at him sadly. The days came and went, but never Weed and Scott. White Fang, who had never known sickness, became so sick that Matt finally brought him inside the cabin. He wrote a letter to Scott. That wolf won't eat. Maybe he's going to die. It was as Matt had said. White Fang lay on the floor of the cabin near the stove, without interest in food, in Matt, nor in life. Matt talked gently to him, but it made no difference. White Fang just turned his dull eyes upon the man and then dropped his head back on his forepaws. One night, Matt was startled by a low whine from White Fang. He had gotten upon his feet, his ears cocked toward the door. A moment later, Matt heard a footstep. The door opened and Weed and Scott stepped in. The two men shook hands. Then Scott looked around the room. "Where's the wolf?" he asked. Then he discovered him, standing where he had been lying, near the stove. He had not rushed forward in the manner of other dogs. He stood, watching and waiting. "Look at him wag his tail," Matt exclaimed. Weed and Scott strode halfway across the room toward him, at the same time calling him. White Fang came to him, not with a great bound, yet quickly. As he drew near, his eyes took on the strange expression. "He never looked at me that way all the time he was gone," Matt commented. Weed and Scott did not hear. He was squatting down on his heels, face to face with White Fang, petting him and listening to him growl. White Fang suddenly thrust his head forward and nudged his way in between his master's arm and body. And here, hidden from view except for his ears, no longer growling, he continued to nudge and snuggle. One night, Scott and Matt sat playing a game of cards before going to bed. A wild scream of fear came from outside. "The wolf's nailed somebody," Matt said. "Bring a light." Scott sprang outside. Matt followed with the lamp, and by its light they saw a man lying on his back in the snow. His arms were folded across his face and throat. He was shielding himself from White Fang's teeth. Weed and Scott grabbed White Fang and dragged him back. Matt helped the man to his feet. As he rose, Matt saw the beastly face of Beauty Smith. Matt let go quickly, as if he had touched fire. At the same moment, Matt shone the lamp on two objects lying in the snow, a steel dog chain and a stout club. Weed and Scott saw and nodded. Not a word was spoken. Matt laid his hands on Beauty Smith's shoulder and turned him around towards the wood. Beauty Smith scurried off. Weed and Scott patted White Fang. "Tried to steal you, eh? And you wouldn't have it. Well, well. He made a mistake, didn't he?" They never saw Beauty Smith again. Bye. Miss you.